Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Catalyst webinar series presented by the Southern California PGA's Education Committee. The Catalyst webinar series is a bi-weekly educational platform for creating success and change in your club and career. Very excited and proud to welcome Mr. Craig Kessler, Director of Governmental Affairs for the SCGA and the de facto staffer for the California Alliance for Golf with us this morning. He's going to be talking a little bit about independent contractors. It's funny, we've got a bunch of independent contractor names that I see on the attendance list this morning that don't normally take the Catalyst. Welcome, everybody. Mr. Kessler, good morning. Welcome to the Catalyst webinar series.
Good morning, John. And it occurs to me as you announced that there are a lot of independent contractors on the phone with us this morning, there's probably somebody out there that might even be able to help this old guy with his golf game, but we'll deal with that after 9 o'clock today. I think all of you know your executive director of the section, Tom Addison. He's got a great sense of humor. And less than 48 hours ago, I was on the phone with him and one of your PGA colleague professionals and John Easterbrook of the PGA of America, not on this particular subject, but on something else entirely. And he innocently asked me what I was doing at 8 o'clock this Thursday morning. And I said, well, nothing. And what did you have in mind? And next thing you know, I was told that somebody had canceled. And he asked me if I would make this presentation. And since I haven't made exactly a presentation, but have been dealing with the issue and writing about the issue pretty extensively this year, I decided I would wing it. So I will apologize in advance that we don't have the greatest slideshow for you. And just before we went on the air, we discovered that for some strange reason, the one of the 4 slides we do have that was most important, we can't seem to get on the screen. So I apologize for that. And what I'm going to do this morning is try to, I'm going to assume that many of you understand the issue or you think you understand the issue. I'm going to state it, and then I'm going to go back and maybe provide a little bit of background and education on a number of things of which you may be unaware about law, courts, presumptions, rebuttable presumptions, statutes, legislative sessions that may confuse you as you hear contradictory things about what your employment status is. This is merely your livelihood, and depending upon who you talk to, you get some different results. So really simply, it sounds simple, but this is what we're dealing with. A California Supreme Court decision that came out last summer that created a test, and I'll get in a moment explain what a test is, that presumptively considers all workers in the state of California to be employee, but permits workers to be classified as independent contractors only if the hiring business demonstrates that the worker in question satisfies each of 3 conditions. First, that the worker is free from the control and direction of the hirer in connection with the performance of the work, both under the contract for the performance of the work and in fact. 2, that the worker performs work that is outside the usual course of the hiring entity's business. And 3, that the worker is customarily engaged in an independently established trade, occupation, or business of the same nature as that involved in the work performed. And as you heard in those simple words, but a fairly complicated issue, you heard that the burden rests upon the employer to demonstrate that all 3 of those conditions are satisfied, not 1 of 3, not 2 of 3, but all 3. And on the screen you do have in front of you, you can see in a somewhat of a nutshell form that what's highlighted is that middle prong that really makes it problematic for, well, a lot of employees in the state, a lot of contractors in the state, but certainly for golf professionals, and particularly a variety of golf professionals, because it's impossible to argue that teaching golf is outside the usual course of a golf course's business. And so now I'm going to double back and explain perhaps what some of those terms mean. And based upon a lot of the questions I've gotten, even these questions as recent as a week ago at the section office, when asking, well, when does this go into effect, it occurs to me that a lot of you don't understand the difference between a court case and a piece of legislation. not all legislation, but most legislation, for example, that may get passed in this 2019 year, almost all of it will become effective on January 1st of 2020. Much of it, as you can recall, with minimum wage legislation and a lot of things that I work in much of my time, water legislation and regulation, it's even beyond that, 2022, 2025, things like that. So it isn't uncommon. But when the California Supreme Court construes California law, the minute, even before the ink is dry on the decision, as soon as it's published, even in its green sheet form, it becomes the law, not of the land, but of the state of California. So at that particular moment, any employer in the state who may have been violating any one of those three conditions or three precepts was vulnerable to either a labor board action, that takes a little bit of time, or more frequently a lawsuit. And there have been hundreds of lawsuits filed based on this since this court decision came down. Most of them are in the delivery and trucking business. To my knowledge, not one is involved in the golf industry, and that's a good thing because that means that it's disgruntled employees or independent contractors who file lawsuits, not those who are pleased. And as we go through this, you're going to discover that the legislative relief I'm going to be talking about in a few minutes that we're seeking in Sacramento, and we're hopeful we could get some narrow carve-out, really goes to the issue of the fact that the Supreme Court did not do a certain class of workers any favors, actually cut into their income, cut into the way they want to live, and made life miserable for them while ostensibly issuing a decision to protect them. So let me back up a moment and explain that California law now and for almost forever has always had an extraordinarily strong presumption in favor of employment status. That is when Party A pays Party B for anything of an ongoing nature, not of a specific nature, not for a purchase and not for a one-time service, it's considered an employer-employee relationship. That is a presumption. The presumption can be rebutted, and the burden of proof on rebutting that particular presumption falls onto the employer. And I trust that everyone understands that he who has the burden of proof has the much more difficult job, because if you simply do nothing, the presumption prevails. So in recent years, a lot of California business, a lot of businesses in other states as well, but particularly in the delivery business, as the computer has made, on-time delivery and a lot of things possible that weren't possible when I was a lot younger, wholesale simply decided to wake up in the morning and shift employees who had been employees from time immemorial to independent contractors. And that spurred lawsuits suggesting that this violated even what was before last summer the leading case in California, which sort of brought together all of the decisions over time about the presumption and created a very complicated 11-prong test that caused confusion and caused a lot of lawsuits, and it dates from 1989. So under the guise of simplifying the interpretation of California law, the court came up with this three-prong test. But I think, as you can see, that virtually anyone who would work on a golf course with any regularity at all, work anywhere, ends up being an employee under this standard. And that would be my definition anyway, and the definition of a lot of others, of a rather significant overreach. There are two ways to remedy that. It's bringing more lawsuits, but by the time a suit makes it through Superior Court, the appellate level, the California Supreme Court takes it on cert and issues a decision, that could be a very, very, very long time. And so that's an extraordinarily inefficient way. And until such time as the court they wouldn't reverse this ruling, but they might seek to clarify it. And who knows if they're inclined to clarify it, that could be a period of years. So courts don't make law, they simply interpret it, and they've interpreted extant law in a certain way. The legislature does. And so immediately after this was issued, and the legislature came back into its very quick 2-week session at the end of August to sort of wrap up business and send everything off to the governor. There was a deadline on that. A lot of the California business community really wanted to bring something up in the special session. organized labor, which is dug in on this particular decision, but not dug in 100%, simply indicated that there wasn't time to fashion something that made any sense, or anything that they would allow to get to 41 or 21 votes in either house of the legislature. And so that was dropped. So we understood that going into this particular session, this is the #1 issue in Sacramento. There's a lot of lobbying activity, there's a lot of buzz, and there is a placeholder bill. Assemblywoman Gonzalez, who is a proponent of taking this decision exactly as it is and codifying it right into the statute, so it's clear, has run into a lot of opposition. So we think there's a great opportunity, based upon some discussions with labor Democrats, those who would traditionally favor labor, but who do understand that this was an overreach and that there are classes of employees in the state of California, not Uber drivers and not Dynamex deliverers, but maybe golf professionals, maybe trainers, maybe yoga instructors, maybe those kinds of persons who definitely have a specific professional expertise and have become independent contractors in this only because if you're a trainer, you do need a venue to train. That's a gym. It can even be a fitness center at golf clubs these days. That's a coming movement. But certainly, it's very, other than the indoor laboratories, I suppose that's an exception. One teaches golf at a golf facility. And there's been a lot of scholarship, a lot of interesting articles written by academics and even by lawyers suggesting that ultimately the solution here might be something in between the wide oscillations between you're either an employee or you're an independent contractor, and there's nothing in between. Maybe a dependent contractor, and that fits golf professionals quite well because you're sort of dependent upon a facility to ply your trade. But in most other respects, as long as you aren't required to do shop hours or anything else that's mandatory by that particular golf course, you are an independent contractor, and anytime you can pick up your lessons and your clients and move it to somewhere else. And in fact, many of you who are quite talented, because you don't want my lousy game associated with you, but are actually attractions at many golf courses. And so I'm talking a mile a minute, and I don't have access to all these slides, and for that, I apologize. I hope what I'm saying is fairly clear as I move in, but there will be some time for questions at the end. But I want to give you a little bit of hope moving forward, because we do believe the golf industry has come together. We're sort of coalescing around a common voice. We will be in Sacramento next Tuesday, and we'll get some idea as to how much traction we can or can't get. This will go through the entire committee process, and legislative relief won't come out if it comes out. I never assume anything in politics. It will come out at the end of August, when it's been thoroughly vetted through the committee process. And so, and the golf industry, we're looking for those that are similarly situated, because we are going to go in, and this is something that I've been asking a lot of GMs, a lot of persons, a lot of management groups in the business, because my impression is when you visit a golf course, anyone you see there on an ongoing basis, whether it's in the clubhouse, it can be a third-party contractor, but they have employees too, or it's on the golf course proper, virtually all of you are employees. There's just this very narrow class. And by the way, and that fact puts us in good stead, because what the court was going after were the businesses that were just wholesale to avoid benefits, wages and hours restrictions, taxes. And the state takes taxes very seriously. They simply reclassified persons based upon really nothing. And to the extent to which we're aggrieved by this, I would hope you'd understand you should focus your grief on those businesses that caused this issue to come to the fore and really caused this. California Supreme Court was utterly unsympathetic to the complainant in the situation, the workers at Dynamex and other trucking companies like Amazon, and drivers like Uber and Lyft. And keep in mind, Uber and Lyft say that they are not in the transportation business. Their business is merely to connect independent contractors who would like to drive and charge with patrons who want to use the service. That's a fiction, no matter how you cut it, because there are a series of rules, series of apps, series of exclusivity that goes into it. It's clearly just a scheme to get around certain other protections under the law. And what the court did for them, what the court did for the delivery persons, was make their lives better and make their incomes better. For the golf industry, it cut into or for a number of other industries, it cut into a model in which there are persons you've done no favor by issuance of this decision. But keep in mind that the decision definitely, it's in position, so any one of you has standing, and if you so choose to sue someone who's hiring you as an independent contractor, and that is what has the golf industry extremely nervous, because anyone can sue anyone at any time. And in this particular case, if this decision, no matter what you may think of it, is going to cause you to perhaps lose it in court, then you've got a series of problems. So it's it's simple, yet the politics of this are relatively complex. I'm not sure that this is enough material to engage an hour, and so I'm going to suggest to our host here, John Kulo, that we might want to open this up for questions sooner rather than later, because the law, the courts, the presumptions, the rebuttal presumptions, the little bit of a primer that I gave on the difference between courts and legislatures and what they both mean practically and otherwise is probably not an hour's full of material. And so I would defer a little bit to our host as to, he might want to open it up earlier, or if there's a possibility of either typing in questions or asking questions. But I would be open to a much more interactive session moving forward, because I laid it out, and I laid out what we're trying to do. And my guess is everyone has very specific questions as to how this sort of general tutorial and this general law and politics affects their lives rather specifically, which may be, as much as I'd like to think that all of you are on this call because you simply wanted to be educated about a little bit about our legal system, that's a nice side benefit. If I were a betting man, I would bet that your real interest is to figure out how this affects your life and what the prospects are for unaffecting your life, perhaps moving into the future. So I may be the only one who's speaking, and I don't know if John Kulo even can come back in, or he probably has the ability because he has the controls to come back in. But John, I'd be willing to open this up a little bit for a more interactive session and a few questions and answers if you're up for it too.
No, absolutely. I'll monitor the question board. Everybody that's on the call, customized questions that are tailored specifically to your independent contracting situation. Feel free to shoot those into the question box, and I'll relay them over to Mr. Kessler. Right away, could you just recover the Dynamex situation again, and how that may affect independent contractors that aren't paying any kind of rent at all? Because there's a lot of independent contractors out there that are there basically in a rent-free structure. Does this potential impact affect them as well, or does it have anything to do with what the dollar amount they're paying in rent actually is?
Good question, and this will lead into a little bit more education about what law is. The answer is, until that is tested by case law, nobody knows, unless the legislature becomes very prescriptive in a statute, and I doubt that there will be any prescription to the level of payment or something. But I think you're going at one of the, at least one major golf employer in the state of California is doing I wouldn't call it a workaround, but trying to insulate their company against any potential legal liability by creating more of a lessor-lessee situation in which the professional is only contact is an agreement in which, and the rent can be $1 a year. It doesn't have to be onerous. I do think there is some, and in which they're doing nothing for the golf facility other than plying their trade I suppose on the driving range there may be playing lessons involved as well. I just don't know that level of detail. But that is one potential workaround. I think one of the things, but the answer is, and this is not a good answer, I don't know. And that is one of the things that's problematic when you have, under the guise of a simplification. I mean, in other words, California Supreme Court didn't change existing law. The presumption of employee status is very strong. It's clear in the statutes. They simply reduced a more complicated test to a very simple one, and in the process seemed to make everyone an employee. I don't know that that was the intent of the legislature, but it's now up to the legislature to change it. So now you're asking questions as to what would happen should someone bring a suit and that point come up. And the real answer is, I don't know. And now you know why this is the #1 issue in Sacramento this year. Did I answer your question, John?
No, not at all.
Well, that's a blunt, I've always known you to be a pretty brave guy. Yeah, basically because I can't answer it, because I couldn't tell you. First of all, I'm not an employment law.
It's like watching the news. Well, does it seem to be that there's a lean or a movement towards a wiser decision to incorporate me as a golf course operator? Is it a wiser decision for me to incorporate our independent contractors into actual paid employees for the purposes of protection, or is it something that's much ado about nothing right now?
With the caveat that I'm not an employment law lawyer, and there are those who specialize it, and there's some good firms in the state of California that would be able to give. So I don't give legal advice, but I can tell you the following. We did have a session with a number of golf professionals and a number of key players from very large management groups in the western part of the country. I think their conclusion after coming out of the 2-hour session, in which they asked a lot of questions to which I said, I don't know, it depends how it would come out in case law. Their conclusion was that if they want to be perfectly safe, is to shift everyone to an employment situation. I don't think that was a unanimous view in the room, but the answer is that's the only way to guarantee that you are not liable. And I would never say it's much ado about, but the only thing I would say is the following. The fact that there's been no lawsuit coming out of the golf industry tells me two things: that that the risk is less, and number two, that those working as independent contractors in the golf industry are not distressed by that situation. My impression is more distressed by this decision, and that it may change their life in a way they don't like and allow them less flexibility. I think if you're one of the classes, one of the sort of more less professional workers, those who really have no, think about the difference. If you cut hair for a living and you're really good at it, you have a client, you have clients, you have people who go to you. They don't go necessarily to the shop. Then if you move, they'll go with you. If you're a teaching professional, you have students who they go to see you. They don't go because they like the color of the clubhouse where you're teaching. So there's a measure of professional expertise. But God, as unqualified as I am for most things, I could deliver boxes. It doesn't take any special expertise. I can't teach golf. I'm not a trainer. I can't teach yoga. I can't do a lot of things. I can't cut hair. I could, but no, I'd get sued. So, and I think those are the differences. And it may seem a little vague to you and to everybody listening on the phone, but those are the differences of which successful efforts to carve some kind of legislation that will cover those classes of persons. It's hard to get your hands around, and there's enormous competition going on right now. And clearly golf is among the smaller of the players, not among the larger players in Sacramento. So we tend to get drowned out. But there are some commonalities. Again, I hope I don't sound like the news to you, John, because that kind of cut. It's taken me a couple of minutes to recover from that comment, but but
You're
I'll
doing
be
us a
okay.
favor by being on the call this morning. I don't know what's wrong with me. I am grateful, very grateful. This kind of came about a while back when the taxing golf thing came up, and I remember 5 or 6 years ago, taxing golf green fees and taxing cart fees. That's going to happen. That's going to come down, and it never did. But it did in other markets. Is this similar to that, where we're just going to continue to be under the radar because we're a specialized mini market per se?
Well, when you talk about taxing golf, that really there was an effort to single out politically weak industries when Arnold Schwarzenegger was governor. It was a badly conceived trial balloon that we got together with a few others and got our pop guns out and shot it out of the sky. I wouldn't make much of that, but there is an underlying move towards service taxes, and there's been a bill introduced in the legislature every year. And the reality is the sponsor of the bill, Bob Hertzberg, understands that as long as we have a big surplus and the economy is humming along, that bill is just going to sit there and perhaps get perfected a little bit every year. So, for example, the municipal golf industry has already been carved out of that bill, not at our behest, but at the behest of governments in the state of California. When we go into recession, which inevitably we will, and California's surplus, which looks really good now, goes into a severe deficit because we have a very volatile tax system. Volatile meaning that we have 0.5% of our population pays over 50% of the taxes, much of it in the form of capital gains. And when markets go down, it isn't the multimillionaires and billionaires are being miserly, it's just that they don't have any capital gains upon which to pay taxes. We'll go into some severe deficits, and everything that's been percolating has been to lower the sales tax, which is high, and substitute and put in place at the same time a service tax. The sales tax came in 1934 when our economy was about 80% goods, and now it's not quite 80% services, but it's probably 70-75% services. So to keep raising taxes on a declining portion of the economy while having no taxes whatsoever on the rising portion, and a situation in which our budgets, our tax receipts oscillate wildly because we're disproportionately dependent upon the highest, wage earners and wealth earners in the state of California. This is going to be the solution. Golf will get caught up in it. Guys like me talk about it all the time because I want everyone to understand that when that tsunami comes, it will come, and we have to be prepared. We will not be able to defeat it, but we have to be prepared to at least try some soft landings or try to at least educate our industry to reorganize some of our affairs. The fact that golf has never been taxed in California, by the way, it's taxed in 22 states right now, and the 23rd is considering it. But the fact that it's never been taxed means that so many of the arrangements we have are not done with tax considerations. So clubs have all kinds of arrangements with assessments and quarterly minima and dues and so forth and so on, and they've never organized that the way in which all of us organize our own affairs for tax avoidance, not evasion, but avoidance. We just don't want the industry to get caught with its pants down, which tends to be what we do. So that's different. So we're not under the radar screen in terms of that issue, and we're certainly not under the radar screen. Here, it isn't a question of being under the radar screen. It's a question of the law is what it is, and right now it depends on people being unhappy and filing a complaint. It can be with a labor board as well. So it goes on complaint as opposed to some things which are regulatory compliance, or in the case of a tax, you have to pay the tax because they track all you because you're audited constantly, and all your receipts are kept in records. Are you getting any questions at this particular point, or is everyone just kind of sitting listening to this thing or watching?
No, I've got several actually.
Okay.
Bob Madsen bluntly is asking if you were an independent contractor, Craig, what would you be doing at this time? 'How would you be looking at this?
I would be looking, and I would love testimonials to take to Sacramento and to explain if Bob Matson believes that by being forced to become an employee, his professional life is diminished. In other words, the court did me no favors. I would love to hear that story, because those are the stories that are going to be compelling. The stories that are going to fall flat in Sacramento are the stories from employers that say, I can't cut it in business, or I can't do this, and so forth. It's going to be the voices of the independent contractors themselves. For those of you who read the Los Angeles Times, I was encouraged when their big story on this, about 10 days or so ago, opened up with a couple of those sympathetic stories from, in this case, it was a hairdresser who in essence said, you just cut my income down and cut all my, you ruined my life basically with this decision. I want everyone to understand, California's political climate and legislature is pro-worker and pro-income distribution. End of story. Anyone who walks into that environment and doesn't understand that, with every word they utter, is not doing their industry any favor, because you are immediately turning off those you're trying to persuade. So I would say to Bob, if you think this decision, I would want to get that story, because ultimately, if you feel that is better for you as a golf professional, and my impression is those I talk to, that's generally the case, then we need to bring all those stories and get them. We can even get one or two to the media, because they tend to look at other things, because even reporters get haircuts, but not enough of them play golf. I can tell you that from experience. I wish more did. That would be my answer to Bob. And he probably didn't like that any more than my answer to you, right, John?
I won't be able to tell. He'll jump back in here. Actually,
okay.
You have one already here. I got another one that says, if the independent contractor pays rent, does that make it clear that they're an independent contractor? Is the only gray area whether or not they're paying rent or not?
No. If you look back, think back to the test, because I can't get the slide up, and I apologize again for that. If the golf course that's receiving the rent requires the professional to do other things that might be considered in the employ of the golf course. In other words, if you have to stand in the shop, if you have to partake in some group lessons, if the independent contractor's relationship is nothing more than, I teach golf, you have stalls, I take the stalls for a certain number of hours or lessons, and on some basis, I bring the students in, well, some of them walk into the place, I suppose. I control the book, I control my prices, and the only thing, if I pay percentage rent, I owe you my books so you get your fair rent. If that's the case, my best guess is that establishes independent contractor, because it's really a lessor-lessee situation. And in fact, an agreement to that effect, and it can be a very simple one, probably protects. The independent contractor does not need the protection here. If somehow someone is being treated as an independent contractor who the California Supreme Court thinks ought to be an employee, they have no legal liability for so doing. It's the employer that has all the liability, and it's the employer that's going to want to probably have something signed and something rather definite. I do know of another company, and I'm not going to name it, that is using that particular model in the sense that they almost having them sign a piece of paper that thou shalt do nothing on behalf of this facility except teach golf, and we have on a basis you will be renting the stall or sharing or doing some kind of share with the lessons that you bring in, and nothing else. Again, to the extent to which my answer was slightly vague, we're dealing with case law right now, and case law is what the court says. And in something like this, where we have a new test, and the test has not been tested, we don't know we don't know how a superior court is going to interpret this, and we don't know, should it get back to the appellate level, how they're going to interpret the fact sequence under this. Again, one of the reasons to try to seek legislative clarification, because in the debate in the legislature and even the commentary or even the rationale that's attached to the bills sort of explains to the courts what the thinking is of the legislature. And just to re-emphasize a point, and I hope I don't insult anyone's intelligence, keep in mind, courts, despite what you hear, do not make law. They merely interpret it. The legislature makes law. So that's why we're seeking relief in Sacramento.
So a lot of this gray area, from what I'm gathering, is because there's no case law in pertaining to the golf industry, but is there case law on the Amazons and the Ubers and the Lyfts of the world yet?
Well, there will be, because a lot of lawsuits have been filed. Clearly, Dynamex is case law on that. In other words, even under the old test, these drivers who were employees became independent contractors, and they filed suit. And ultimately, that suit made it to the California Supreme Court, which saw fit to simplify its old leading case, which came from 1989, which over the years had devolved into 11 different tests, some of which, if you read it, are contradictory and caused confusion, and actually led the Amazons and the Dynamex to believed that based upon that, they could reclassify these drivers as independent contractors by taking a step or two or three. And the result of that is they lost their shirts at trial, and they lost big judgments. And that's the danger here. But they pushed it, and they lost. And as the result of the loss, we have a different interpretation moving forward. I am not aware, and again, you'd have to consult an employment lawyer, of any case law really involving the golf industry and this particular issue. There may be a few labor board claims, but those probably have to do more with disputes about hours than disputes about status, would be my strong guess. Yes, that's my way of saying I ran out of oxygen, John.
Oh, okay, no, it's okay. I don't actually have. We've reached our minimum in terms of 40 minutes. And Craig, you may or may not know this, but every PGA member that's on this call this morning, they listen in and they view the Catalyst webinar, and then at the end of the presentation, we send out a small quiz, and they take the quiz and they send it back into the headquarters. If they get a 70% or better on the 10-question quiz, they get 1 MSR credit for attending the Catalyst. It's actually the reason why the program exists. Like so many PGA professionals, what we do before things like internet-based MSR opportunities like this came along, in the 3-year cycle, we wouldn't do anything until the last year, and we've got to get all these points in this last year, and basically we blitzkrieg around our section of the United States in the last 6 months of the 3rd year of the cycle, going to this seminar and going to this 2-day expo and trying to get the points. So the nice thing about webinar internet-based programs like this is PGA professionals from the comforts of their desk or their home or their workspace can log on for free and take these educational opportunities incrementally throughout the 3-year cycle and get all or most of their MSR requirement done in a way that's a little more conducive to actual education. And that's exactly what this has been. I know you're probably not satisfied with a lot of the answers that you've been giving in this topic, but what you have brought to our attention, Craig, is this is something that's out there, and like a lot of things in the golf industry, we don't worry about it or address it until it's affecting us, and a lot of times it's until it's affecting us negatively. You've done us a service today by putting this on our radar, especially all those independent contractors out there, because you said something that was compelling, where I totally believe that if an employer or a corporation certainly went before the powers that be and said, hey, I can't make money in this structure of having all the independent contractors now as employees on my staff, that's totally going to fall on deaf ears. However, if we've got all these independent contractors that, teach, $90,000 worth of instructions a year and pay a rent of about $30,000, and that's their livelihood, they're making $50K or better. And now they have to get absorbed into an hourly employment structure where they have to, work counter shifts or do other things that take them away from their instruction. And to boot, their instruction is commission-based or garnished, so to speak, by the employer. Those are the stories that are going to get a lot of press because, that is going to affect them tremendously. So we appreciate you bringing that to our attention this morning because it certainly wasn't on my radar. And, I don't have an independent contractor at my property at the moment, but I have. And, it's always one of those things where, the quality of your instruction, and this is just a generalization, the quality of the instruction and the availability of the instruction typically seems to be better when you do have an individual or a core of individuals that are independent contractors there to do nothing but teach, as opposed to when you're trying to, when the facility is trying to set up instruction as a revenue source and staff it and payroll it and try to attract the revenue. Typically, the latter is the better model. So I certainly appreciate.
And John, I would also add that there's a very real danger in the conversations I've had of the actual contraction of the opportunities to teach, as the employers are burdened increasingly by all kinds of things. They may simply determine that this was never for them, this was more amenity than revenue center, and they may focus on the revenue center, and that is going to badly hurt the PGA golf professionals in California. But before we go away, since I see at 27 now, not 28, if any, I'd like to give out my email address because any individual stories do matter and they are compelling. So if any of you want to share or at least add your name that I could cite in Sacramento or cite in meetings or share with other of my colleagues, as in someone who has been hurt, and if any of you would be willing to talk to the media, make that point. I will not give your names to anyone if you don't authorize it. But my email address is C as in Craig, Kessler, Kessler, @scga.org. If you forget that, just send something into the section. They know where to find me as well. And those stories, you're correct, John, those stories will be very compelling.
Yeah, I'll put your contact information on the quiz and also in the body of the email, attaching the YouTube recording of this Catalyst. In fact, did I forget to tell you that? We are recording, and we do upload this to the SCPGA YouTube page, and that makes the quiz kind of open book from that standpoint. Did I forget to disclose that?
No, that's just fine. And I would say I've done these before, John, and usually with more than 30 hours notice of something, I prepare, 8, 10, 12 slides and a little more something that you could actually quiz on, and often on a subject that's more definitive, that is amenable to taking a test, whereas this one had a lot of answers. This is what we're trying to do. This is what we're faced with. We don't know. And again, it's that confusion. And this is a hot issue in Sacramento, so that means we're one of many trying to seek relief.
I do have another question here from Craig Kaminsky out of Mountain Meadows. By bringing stories about the golf industry to the public, can we be shining a flashlight on our industry that would not be necessary?
No, that's an interesting point. Always people, by the way, everyone knows we're there. In this particular case, the light is not on the industry, though, and everything everything I've done is predicated on something I said earlier in this conversation, and that is go to a golf course, and virtually everyone you see on an ongoing basis, not someone there to fix the plumbing, on an ongoing basis is an employee and has been and will continue to be an employee. There are a few people you see almost all of them, notice I haven't talked about caddies for obvious reasons, but there's one, and that person is a professional and has a book and has clients that is not. And that is actually benefits them, it benefits the game, it benefits the facility, and to take that away is bad public policy and causes harm. And in a story where you're talking about shining the light, the public needs to see that this is not entirely about drivers being taken advantage of, but persons that have been caught up in this, who are quite happy with the status they have and prefer it to the status that they may get stuck with because the California Supreme Court came up with a test that's way too broad. It's hard for me to see how there would be anything negative in that. And I would add something that sort of implicit in the question, and I think, John, you know this, but that the golf industry has made a terrible mistake in thinking that it needed to hide. Because, and I've said this many times in many speeches, in many public forums, that as an advocate for the golf industry, I have a huge advantage over advocates in other industries, in that if I can actually tell the unvarnished truth about what we do, and this is more in the environmental realm than this particular realm, we go up in lawmakers' estimation, because what they think of us is worse than the reality. So taking reality and shining a light on us does the golf industry well. Now, there are other industries, and I have friends who advocate, for example, in the oil and gas industry, and they, let me put it this way, they don't want anyone knowing what they're doing because it would scare the hell out of you. But I think it's important. I think particularly the way we manage water, the way we manage the environment, and the way we manage our business enterprises. I think the golf industry, instead of worried about what people will see, I'm very familiar with Mountain Meadows. I'd like to shine a light on what goes on in Mountain Meadows and put it on the front page of the LA Times. So Craig, I can pronounce your name. You should be proud of what you're doing.
Craig says thank you. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, that's about all the time we have this morning for the Catalyst webinar. Mr. Craig Kessler, Director of Governmental Affairs for the SCGA and the California Alliance for Golf, thank you very, very much for helping us out. Obviously, you're a friend of the section in many, many ways for a very long time. And please forgive me for my comment about watching the news. I owe you one there for sure. Everybody stand by. We're going to send out the recording for the Catalyst this morning on YouTube. The link will be on the email along with the quiz. Please take the quiz and return the quiz to Sharon Kerfman at SCRUFMAN at PGAHQ, S. Kerfman at PGAHQ. A score of 70% or higher will earn 1 MSR for attending this morning's Catalyst. Stand by also on March 28th, 2 weeks from today, Susie Whaley, President of the PGA of America, will be on the Catalyst. We'll be doing it in a little different forum that day. She's not actually going to do a PowerPoint presentation. She is going to have something on her screen, her picture and her bio and maybe the PGA logo, but it is going to be a Q&A between her and myself. And but we'll register for the Catalyst the same way that you always do. You'll get the notification and the link to get on there, and we'll do it just like any other Catalyst, just with only one slide, very similar to the Catalyst if you were on it with Seth Waugh. But we're very excited to get her on. It was a process getting her booked in because obviously she's a very, very busy person, but we are very much looking forward to that. And thank you very much, everybody. Have a great day in the golf business. Thank you, Mr. Kessler. Talk to you guys soon.
Been a pleasure.